I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Lorraine Smith. Lorraine, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's great to be here.
I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself to our audience and describe what you do. And I know that that is a very deep and complex question, but how would you describe the work that you're doing in the world?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to keep it simple. What I do now is I work on the shift to an economy that works in service of life. That's my purpose. That's what drives everything I do, and I can definitely unpack what that economy looks and feels like. The way I do that is really structured in three simple ways. I do a fair bit of writing, so I observe what I see around me or what I've seen working really well, what I'm hoping for, and I put that out into the world, usually in the form of articles on Medium and sometimes on my blog on my website as well. I do a fair bit of public speaking, so I get invited into corporate contexts, conferences, in academia as well, to share my perspective, having worked for a long time in the corporate sustainability or corporate responsibility field. It's also sometimes called ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting strategy. So I show up as a speaker, I guess you could say. And the third way, that's really something that's evolved more recently, is working as an advisor or a guide, either one-on-one with individuals who are really starting to see their roles within industry needing to change and looking for help, tools, guidance for how to change their roles so they can be part of that economy that works in service of life. And also as a guide, I work with some executives, more sort of C-suite board level within large companies, to help them see their business models as, let's say, having opportunities to evolve their business models so that they could be part of that economy as well. So I write, I speak, and I guide.
Fantastic. So you talk about working for an economy that's in service of life. And I do want to unpack that with you and
Yeah.
help us understand what you mean by that.
Sure, yeah. So there's a lot of ways we can talk about that. So I'm going to give what I would call a broad definition. And I'm even aware as I'm saying it that words can be really constraining. And there's not a lot I can say to describe something that doesn't fully exist yet. So I just put that caveat out there, and I invite anybody who's listening to sort of critique or wonder to themselves as they're listening to me, how would they better describe it? But this will be my best effort in this, on this particular Tuesday. An economy that works in service of life looks like any business or organization delivering what it brings to the market, services, products, needs, wants, in a way that increases biodiversity, that strengthens communities, that enables humans to be healthier, more well, better able to look after themselves and others. So by doing business, we see thriving. We see the conditions that enable life to thrive. And I want to explain that just a little bit further, because what sometimes, well, a couple of things happen. Either sometimes people hear that and they're like, that's not going to happen, right? Like, because by the way, when I say an economy that works in service of life, I mean the whole thing. Every industry, every business, every entity delivering on our needs and wants functions in a way that is self-reinforcing in a life-affirming way. So that either elicits a kind of laughter, like, dream on, or a bit of a defensive stance of like, well, yeah, you mean like a healthcare provider, right? Or like, you could make all kinds of arguments that, a sportswear company that makes gear so I can go outside and you can play hockey or whatever the thing, those are good things, right? It's good to do sports. Sure. But if by doing business, that company is dependent on a toxic supply chain with people who do not earn a living wage in a structure that maximizes wealth aggregation, that's its corporate structure. It's not maximizing biodiversity. It's not maximizing human health, other than perhaps through the sports that people play. But even then, a lot of times that gets kind of fetishized with famous pro sportsmen and women, versus just being healthy, getting outside, right? So the economy that I am moving towards and that I see evidence of around me and a real need for is one where that sports equipment company and that healthcare provider, they only function within a thriving, healthy biosphere and community, and they contribute to it. They draw from it and they contribute to it like any other healthy natural system.
Mhm. What you're describing is really a very deep and fundamental shift in the way that we approach the world and our economy. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge my appreciation for how you approach these things in this manner of you, as you even said, like sort of not knowing even exactly what you're up to here. And I've listened to you on other podcasts and read your work. And I mean, to me, that there's something so authentic and really wonderful about that process of like unpeeling and unpacking and discovering, really like following some sort of intuition. And I almost feel like we're all figuring it out together.
Mm.
When you work with executives and people, you know, in business and at high levels, like how are they coming to the table in this conversation? Are they approaching you saying like, Lorraine, I really want to see this different world and I'm not sure how to get there? Or are you kind of introducing this new way of being to them, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the feedback. I do sometimes feel like I am a bit of a heretic or a little bit out in the wilderness. And by the way, I also try not to take myself too seriously because it's emergent, right? Like I only really only kind of know what I'm doing, and I'm constantly seeking out people who understand things better and trying to learn from them and follow them around and not bother them too much. I think I'm a little bit of a pain in the butt sometimes. Um, Shout out to Patty Krawick, whose book Becoming Kin I is just really one of the greatest books, and I just keep tagging her on everything, and I wonder when she's going to be like, this is now stalking, so please don't. This is not promotion, this is irritation. In any case, there are a lot of people who understand the things that I believe we're moving towards in a more fundamental, comprehensive, scholarly, rigorous way. And so I want to thank you for calling me authentic, and then also just call myself out a little bit. I have a long way to go. So how do I do what I do? Well, up until this year, I did what I was doing in a very conventional consulting way. And I'll explain that a little bit and then compare and contrast. So for the last 20 years, I've been a pretty conventional sustainability consultant. That's a person who gets hired. I've mostly freelanced. I've also worked in-house at a couple of firms. It means I'm hired to work on a project for a company who's trying to do something on their sustainability program. I'm being like vague and quick because I could drill down. There's lots of texture to this, but what that typically meant was a company who's setting goals around, let's say, having better climate impact, better impacts in their community, et cetera. They're setting goals, they're measuring and managing their goals, and they want to do more. They want to report on their progress. They want to engage with stakeholders or communicate better with their investors, et cetera. There's a whole field of sustainability, environmental, social governance, ESG, reporting, engagement, goal setting, et cetera. And I have done a lot in that field. That's kind of whence I came. And so that is most of the work that I've been doing and getting paid for the last 20 years. Over that time, I went through sort of waves of optimism, like, okay, this isn't really working, but this new thing might work, this new and improved framework, this, the sustainable development goals, the task force on climate related financial disclosure, all these sort of new things kept coming in to kind of solve for the things that really weren't making the change. And so each round I'd be like, this is going to do it. And of course it didn't, because rearranging, to borrow an overused metaphor, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic is just that. It does not turn the ship around. It doesn't even really acknowledge that there is a ship. And so I came to a pretty resounding conclusion. It took me a bit, but this point last year, literally October 2021, I said no more. Although I appreciate my clients and I do believe there is meaningful groundwork being done and real intentions, to me that is insufficient to show up, like to bring myself there every day and get paid to do work that I do not believe is making the difference. So I stepped out entirely. I stopped taking new projects of that type. It took a while to kind of wind down out of the ones I was in and be willing, frankly, to just step off a financial ledge and say, I won't accept payment for that. And I'm not sure what I will accept payment for. So stand by, and I actually moved to a less expensive place to live and just radically pared down and gave myself a tiny bit of a runway. And I spent time actually consulting without a real client. And so I'll get to your question about how do I do this with executives and leaders. I actually asked myself, well, if I had been hired to do what I think needs doing, what would I do?
Hmm.
And I just proceeded to do that. And I made it very public. I did it in the public square. I'm a pretty quiet little public square. So, the three people who paid attention, thanks, Mom, thanks, David. There were a couple
Right.
others.
Right.
They are, they gave me feedback and I was able to just give myself the time and space to do what I thought needed doing. And because I've been in the field of sustainability and ESG for 20 years, I have a lot of relationships. I know a lot of people in a lot of companies. I used to live in New York for a decade. That's where a lot of my ESG work kind of took hold. So I worked in the US. I haven't had a Canadian client for a long time. I've worked with clients in Brazil, in Europe, the UK, spent some time in a lot of different parts of the world and in different sectors as well. So banking, forestry, mining, oil and gas, food, pharma, etc. So what that meant is while I was in this experimental mode, consulting to an imaginary client who I would just sometimes call the future, I would continue to have these conversations in relationship with some of the senior folks I've come to know and just kind of share. That's what you could just call conversations, not consulting. And so at a certain point, quite recently, I realized, okay, that's been really interesting, really informative. I'm proud of what I've put out into the world, and it's helped me understand better what needs doing and what is not to be done. And so from there, I launched a more formal advisory practice. And it actually remains to be seen how the senior folks will show up. By senior folks, I mean those currently in decision-making roles in large companies.
Mm-hmm.
I do work directly with a number of people who are not in those roles in a paid capacity, but currently none of those super senior decision maker folks are formally engaging me. So I actually don't have a real answer for how I'll do it. I have some ideas about how I'll do it, and I'm really excited to hear who shows up and wants to imagine themselves into that future and then nudge their business models along with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Take me back to this transition period where you're doing the work that you've been doing for 20 plus years, but you're finding that it's just not making the deep fundamental change that you really want to see happening. What is it? There's something inside of you that wanted to see something different, and you wanted to consult and meet with people in a different way. What was that you were striving for? Like the type of work that you would be doing, or this other outcome that you wanted to see in the world? And I know it's hard to like put language on it, so I'm even sort of
Yep.
hesitant to ask the question, but I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, what
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah. Two things come to mind there. One is what I was observing around me. And then the other relates to my career, which clearly has taken a backseat. Let me talk to the world around me first, and then talk about the work itself. So, especially in more recent years, like for me, when I think about the Sustainable Development Goals coming out, which was, I think that was around 2015 when most of the nations participating in the United Nations sort of came together through different types of engagement and created this set of 17 goals. Underneath them are, I believe, 169 targets, and then another 200 and some indicators. And I remember I was in the thick of things. I had a pretty senior role at a very well-regarded sustainability consulting firm. I was working with Fortune 500 companies at a relatively senior level within the company, across sectors. At that time, I was doing a really big project in education, another one in media, another one in healthcare. I mean, I was in the thick of things, and I was like, this is so exciting, right? This is what we need. We need to really reimagine how businesses show up in the world. And here we have this incredible menu of goals and really specific targets and indicators that have come from the whole wide world. This is going to be terrific. And then watching things happen and noticing that although companies, you could argue, they have embraced the SDGs, as they're known, the Sustainable Development Goals, and you can look at pretty much any large company's website. If they're publicly traded, especially, they'll have a lot more disclosures. But even some of the private companies, you can go on their websites, you can read their sustainability reports. I might have even had a hand in writing their sustainability report. You're going to see the SDGs all over the place. And it's going to seem that they have embraced the SDGs. And yet, very little actually changed within the businesses. I mean, they may have done a better job of gathering and organizing information. There may have been more partnerships, more initiatives, more like cool things happening, maybe a bit of a tidying up of some of the goals, but the business model remained the same. The growth imperative remained the same. And generally speaking, the net impact on society remained the same, and in some cases just plain old worsened. I mean, just a quick anecdote on that. One of the things I did when I gave myself that time to just consult on behalf of the future in the way I thought made sense is I conducted what I called materiality assessments, spelled with reality inside the word materiality, unlike the way that the ESG community typically does it. And by applying this lens of reality, I did an assessment on TD Bank. All this information is public, so I only used public information, and I disclosed everything I found. If anybody sees errors, they can please let me know, and I'll happily make a correction. TD Bank, like any other large financial services company, is making all kinds of amazing noises about their sustainable finance and their, embracing of the SDGs. If you look at their ESG disclosures, it looks like they're doing all kinds of cool stuff. And it's true, like their lawyers wouldn't sign off on that if those things weren't true. But if you take one of their annual reports from 10 years ago and an annual report from most recently, so you're comparing apples to apples a decade apart, the company has doubled its financing of fossil fuels. Right? It's in some cases tripled its financing of mining. So what's really going on here? So I was noticing as I was inside companies doing, and by the way, I've never been engaged by TD Bank. I only did public assessments on companies that I've never worked for. So that way it's like really, truly what I found in the public domain. But this is true of companies that I worked within and haven't worked within, that all this talk of the SDGs and all these other sustainability frameworks and initiatives were really just table of contents, just organizing information, not changing. Meanwhile, the other thing I was observing around me, so I was learning a lot. I was getting exposed. And one of the things I think is really important is getting exposed to things I don't understand by people who have totally different views. And so as these years post SDGs were going by, I was getting more exposure to what we might call the global South, and to very different worldviews on how we got to where we are. And I found that the way I'd learned my own history and the history of the corporation, the history of settlement, of colonialism, of pretty much all the things that matter when you try to shift an organization, I had huge gaps in my understanding. And when I started to fill in those gaps, and then I looked at the SDGs, I was like, oh my God, they just propagate the problem. Like they're based on growth, GDP growth. They're based on an educational model that says, kids have to go to school, sit in a classroom, be taught at for a certain number of years. I'm being blunt and generalizing, but it's not based on nothing. And so I realized that the harder I worked in this, the more I doubled down on the SDGs, the more I weighed in and built slides and engaged executives and helped come up with amazing, ambitious, overarching strategic frameworks, the more I was powering the machine that is causing the harm.
Right.
So that was like, it was a deep realization. That's the bigger part. The smaller part of my career was that I realized that I have a pretty unique skill set. Like, I've been in the ESG trenches for 2 decades. As they've kind of grown up, I've been part of the before and after of some of the frameworks that investors look for, things like SASB and Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and a number of frameworks that are very highly discussed right now in the ESG sustainability investor corridors. Like, been there, done that, helped inform the development of the framework. I know these things really well. And I speak a few languages. I lived in Brazil, so I'm fluent in Portuguese. I speak French and English, and enough to be dangerous in German and Spanish. I've been across lots of sectors and regions and been backstage in a lot of industrial value webs. So I was like, well, why don't I kind of put that to good use? Right? Like, why don't I take what I understand as best I can and help deploy it in a direction that I think makes sense?
Mhm.
So that's a long answer to how that shift took place, but it basically came from recognizing what I was doing wasn't really working and believing that I could take what I know and what I'm capable of and put it towards something that would work.
Mhm. So these companies that are hiring you and your colleagues to help
Mm.
them with their sustainability goals, and here you guys are working your tails off and publishing all this information and collecting data. What do you think is behind the motivation to pursue these goals and to do this work, if at the end of the day it kind of seems like it's just a matter of kind of showing good face to the public? Is it just a matter of kind of image and looking good and looking like they're working on these issues that people care about? Do you think that there is initially some intention there to really improve their sustainability, but we're so caught in a system that's like addicted to, fossil fuels and just the model of how things are, that we can't get ourselves out of it? Why is this not working?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a big question. I think a lot of what you just said is true in different ways. I mean, to be really clear, I can't really speak on anyone else's behalf. And even where I look at what I've observed, I have to be careful about making assumptions about why things are happening. But maybe I'll kind of do a kind of a core sample or a little core drilling into an aggregated set of what I saw without throwing any one, company or team or person under the bus, because I actually don't think this is about one company or person or team. We need to remember that there are a lot of layers within businesses. So, for example, the client that I might have been working with, the direct humans that I'm talking to and getting instructions from and feedback, and as we go, they may have one set of ideas and a way of understanding and their own motivations and intentions that could actually be different than the person they report to, than the board members of the company, than the investors. Just like, we're all our own little unique individuals, and so we've got different ways of understanding and experiencing the world. And I don't necessarily know what all of those things were. But if I were to bundle it all together and say, well, what color is that core sample? I would say it is the color of a system that is doing what it is designed to do, which is maximize profits.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be judgmental about that if I wanted. I could say, and that's really bad and, hurting people. But I want to keep judgment aside because I don't think it's helpful. I want to just notice why these things perpetuate. And so when a company, so I'm going to throw in some additional complexity here, and this gets pretty uncomfortable actually, but let's take something like climate ambitions or climate goals within a company. And let's say it's a company that isn't like, the big baddies that get targeted. So a fossil fuel company, for example, let's say it's a sporting goods company just for fun, because they're, might have a nice brand. It might be an everyday product that I like and use and I'm glad to have. And yeah, they're consuming things and they get used up, but they're not like they're not in the crosshairs necessarily of climate change.
Mhm.
But everybody's connected and everything is related. Well, what we see happening is this hyper focus on emissions reduction. And it becomes a counting contest. Let's count our emissions. There's a more or less agreed global methodology to inventory your greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. The GHG protocol established, I believe, in the 90s, actually. And it's based on real science. And, there's a way to do it. Just like you can count calories or you can weigh yourself. We have ways of doing these things. When we only look at GHG emissions, which is what the vast majority of global corporate climate action is about, two really scary things happen. One is we miss everything else, like biodiversity, like social impacts. There's this phrase that's been coming up quite a bit, which I think is really effective, called I'm forgetting it, carbon tunnel vision, which is just like we're hyper focused on carbon. And so we miss all these other factors. There's some great infographics out there. If people just Google carbon tunnel vision, they'll see that, when you laser focus on this one thing, you create distortions. So that in and of itself is a problem. But the other problem that I don't know which one's bigger, they're both big and I don't like them, is that we see these ambitions. Let's take net zero by 2050. This is a big kind of hashtag out in the world. Well, first of all, 2050 is kind of soon, like it's less than 30 years away. But it's not so soon that we need to really do things about it. And so we see these net zero by 2050 goals coming up, and they may even have the science-based target, SBT or SBTI, science-based target initiative, attached to it. There's all kinds of critiquing going on around that, some very technical and important critiques. I would just say conceptually, claiming that you have a target that is science-based that will be achieved by 2050, that's like me saying, well, the science says that smoking is pretty bad for my health. Not a lot of debate on that. I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day. I don't really, this is fictitious. I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and the science is telling me I probably should stop. So, okay, I'm gonna stop. By 2050, I won't be smoking. So let's see, by 2040, I'll have cut my smoking in half. I'll only be smoking 1 pack a day. And it's gonna be tough that last decade, but I'm gonna really taper down so that by 2050, I'll only be vaping. That's what these targets amount to. So not only are they unhealthy, right? Like anyone could say, science, health, common sense, 5-year-old could tell you all that smoking between now and then is going to be doing a lot of damage. But the thing that's even more missing, like paradigms falling apart here, why are you smoking 2 packs a day? Why is smoking 2 packs a day a normal thing right now? Why is that even profitable? Why are we encouraged now busting out of the metaphor, in our corporate structures to proceed now, today, and for years to come in extremely harmful ways that, by the way, we know are harmful? If we don't really stand back and say, oh, hang on, 2050 is 30 years away. It's not even 30 years away. We need to do this now. We need to truly understand the structural harm, the legacy of oppression, the results of an economy that really was built on stolen land and slavery in multiple regions around the world. And then we need to ask ourselves, what's our role? What is my role as an individual who makes decisions, who goes about my day, in seeing that and inviting an alternative? And if we aren't doing that, coming back to the prompt of this, what is the motivation behind what we're doing now? If we aren't doing that, there's something in our way. Is it fear? Is it all the things that bundle into what we call addiction? Is it ignorance? I think in some cases there is still tremendous ignorance about the basics of climate action, about the basics of our legacy of slavery and stolen land. And, we get some hashtags and some like fun memes on Instagram, but we don't have a lot of people openly talking about how we got here. And so I think there's a lot of people who think we're actually pointed in the right direction. We just need to maybe hurry up a bit, maybe invite others along. Yeah, it's a complex set of barriers, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My kind of overall takeaway, I think, that I want to bounce back off of you is that really what we need to be more aware of are the systems, the paradigms that are in place that are leading to the problems and the symptoms that we're having in the world, not just fixing things within that system kind of on a surface level.
Yeah.
You were using the analogy of like smoking, and I'm trying to think of how to kind of flesh this analogy out a little bit, but it's almost like, we need, like, we're smoking to get our needs met somehow. I don't know, like coping with stress or anxiety or something like that. And we're just saying, okay, just stop smoking. But there's no other way, there's no substitute for that behavior, or there's no other way of helping that person get their needs met at a fundamental level, or there's no broader shift in kind of how we're thinking about health. Like, it's not in the analogy of our climate, if smoking is carbon emissions, if we just focus on that one thing, that can improve people's health, but it's not going to holistically improve health. We also need to focus on diet and exercise and social connection. So it's much, much wider than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll reflect a little on that, because I think that's actually a really helpful example of where we hit a fork in the road and we need to go both ways. So you said, if I'll paraphrase and maybe miss a few words, but you said something like, if smoking is carbon emissions, we need to stop smoking, but there's all these other things. Yes. And smoking is more than carbon emissions. It's an addictive behavior. It's an incentivized, profitable product that's actually harmful. And. So it's carbon emissions and it's a whole bunch of other things. And right now we're only focused on carbon emissions.
Mm-hmm.
We can play this metaphor out in a whole bunch of ways. I'll give a couple more and then I'll give some ideas about where I see the path out. So, we have lots of folks thinking about their health, right? Maybe they want to lose weight. Maybe they're not smoking, but they, maybe the kids are a little bit more grown up and suddenly realize they've just been putting on weight year after year. So they go to the gym. There's nothing wrong with going to the gym. Well, there could be, but there's not necessarily, right? It could be great. Community, you enjoy it, you like music, whatever, and maybe it gets you on a healthy track. But we know that being healthy, including being a healthy weight, is a lot more than paying a membership to a facility and showing up there. There are many, many, many factors that lead to our health, including our weight, right? It isn't just calories in, calories out. If it were that simple, we'd see a lot more people of a healthy body weight. Our endocrine systems, our hormonal systems, our digestive systems, our immune systems. I mean, the interconnected, dynamic living thing that is the human body is incredible. And it is designed with so many different self-adapting aspects to it that if we think it's as simple as paying, the 20% discount on the January gym membership, no wonder we're sorely disappointed come March, right? So what do we do about it? Well, I think there's a lot of options. I actually just published a piece just before going live here about motivation and how to stay motivated on this path. And I think it's related to, well, how do you quit smoking? If it's just stopping doing the thing that was kind of feeling good, even though it's bad, then all you're doing is losing. Right? You're just not getting the thing. And then you sit in this space of lack. But lack is no fun. Lack is lacking. So what does it look like to get out of lack? The number one thing I aim to do is put myself in the paradigm I want to be in.
Mhm.
Because what we're really talking about here is a paradigm shift. If we go, well, actually, can I take a step back? Can I go into a little bit of systems theory for a sec here?
Oh, please. I would love that.
Okay, cool. So probably your listeners are way ahead of me on this, but I'm going to just touch on really basic aspects of systems theory because they're really practical and they're helpful to notice here. 'Cause you alluded to, this is about the system seeing itself, and I think that's quite important. A system can be anything. It can be a school, it can be your kidney, it can be a whole country. We can interpret a system in many ways, but at its simplest, a system has individual elements that have relationships between each other in pursuit of a common purpose. Purpose with humans, like a school, we could, depending, of course, but we'll be simple and say a school's purpose is to educate people. With a kidney, we could call it a function. And I
Mhm.
think the function of a kidney is to clean the blood. It's probably doing all kinds of things that I don't understand. It has a function. I don't get to decide. It's just happening. It's doing it right now. I'm talking to you. And that system I could call my kidney is fulfilling its function. Okay, so we got basic systems, and then we got really smart people like Donella Meadows, who came before us and did some great thinking on systems and how to intervene in systems in order to change them. Because what we're talking about here right now is the global industrial complex. It's a really big system. It's
Mhm.
like, it's everything. It's industries, industry associations, employees, governments, boards, big private companies, big public. I mean, woof, you want to change the industrial complex. I want to change the industrial complex so that it serves life. Right now,
Mhm.
I think it's harming life. I want it to change in service of life. That's a big change. So how do I intervene in that system? Well, according to the lovely Donella Meadows and many others who've been thinking about this and looking for ways to influence change over time, there are more or less effective places to intervene in a system, or levers, we can call them. And some of the least effective places would be things like looking at the numbers, the data. So the school wants to educate kids. Well, let's get as many kids as possible to get high test scores. Okay, that might not hurt. But if the focus is on test scores, then we know what happens. We start to teach to the test. We
Right.
start to weed out and see suffering kids who, for whatever reason, are not going to perform well on a test, but may in fact have incredible intelligence and all kinds of great things to explore from an educational perspective. So we can see that that may not be a great place to intervene. What if we go up, and I could go all the way through her 12 places or 9 places, depending on the year of the article you read, of places to intervene in a system. I'll cut to the chase and say the most powerful places to intervene are at these sort of higher levels, avoiding hierarchy, but nonetheless noting there are higher levels within a system and other levels that aren't as
Right.
powerful. The highest place to intervene in a system is at the level of changing the paradigm.
Yeah.
And so imagine if the school, it used to say, our purpose around here is to educate kids. And what if, I'm just making this up, it's neither good nor bad, but what if the school trustees, the people who run the school, the people who make decisions, hey, maybe even the students, I don't know, said the purpose of this school is to empower all of us to create thriving communities. Maybe that's a good purpose. I don't know. Well, if that were the purpose, imagine what would change. Maybe there wouldn't even be test scores. Maybe all of the tests would be around understanding what thriving communities look like, right? Like goodbye trigonometry, unless somebody can say, understanding trigonometry really helped me increase the, soil health of my local neighborhood. Changing paradigms is fundamental. So that was a quick little journey down the trail of systems thinking. I'll now come back to, so what do we do about this? I believe that the paradigm of an economy that works in service of life already exists. It's all around us in different ways. It must exist in order for me to be able to sense it and even use these words, right? These thoughts are among us. I didn't make them up. I'm not smart enough to do that, and I don't have that power. I do have the power to notice and listen. And so where does this paradigm already exist? Well, in some cases, it exists in really kind of micro places. Like really simply, I could take an example in my own household. I could look at my worm composters. I could say, well, they're taking my kitchen scraps and they're turning it into amazing soil. And then that's going into my plants and my garden, and it's creating this very wonderfully self-reinforcing, life-affirming, wonderful conditions that enable life to thrive. You can say, well, Lorraine, that's not an economy. Well, no, but all an economy is a sort of needs delivery mechanism. And it actually means looking after the home, if we want to go into the root of the word. And we can then step wider and look at examples of economic activity that work in service of life. We can see historically many, many cultures, communities, regions, call them religions or spiritual tendencies, that were all about working in service of life. And we can see examples of this. An easy one in our modern economy that's all around us. We see an emergence of dialogue around something that's been here for more than 100 years, the co-op model, right? So the co-op corporate governance structure, the cooperative model. I'm not proposing that it's perfect and it's not without its flaws, but it is designed to sort of bring the value that's being created by the people, by the company, by its products and services back into the people and its community. It is, by definition, there is no CEO. It is organizationally structured to be self-reinforcing in a positive way. Many, many examples I could draw on that are little, mind-bending, big, still needs improvement. But the bottom line is, as much as I can put myself into the paradigm that I'm seeking, I can then experience it, understand it from people who know it better than I do, ask questions of it, and then sort of take those answers and listen to them in different contexts and bring them into new and different conversations. That's just one way that I seek to stay motivated on this path, because it is a big change. And there are, if I wanted, I could just stare at the impenetrable walls all around me, but I far prefer to look at the doors and windows and see what's going on the other side.
Mm-hmm. That's so helpful to think about things from that systems view. And as you mentioned, thinking about where we can intervene at the highest levels, at the level of the paradigm. And, listening to you talk and, being familiar with your work now, I think what you're getting at, and you can tell me if I'm picking up on this accurately, is that you would really like us to define what is the world that we want to live in. It's almost like we haven't consciously recognized or labeled that highest level of the system, the paradigm that we actually do want. And we haven't asked ourselves the question as a collective, whether it's, just, society or the leaders in society, what is the world that we want to live in? Okay, this is the world. Now let's design systems and economies and paradigms that actually serve that. We're almost just unconsciously operating within the systems and the paradigms that we've been living under, but that are not serving us, but we're so attached to them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I am not necessarily expecting, let's say, everybody to get together and redesign systems in a new paradigm. I'm not even sure I would want to participate in that if I got invited to it. Maybe I'm not very nice. But more recognizing that in a very distributed way, like this changes of all kinds are happening all around us in all kinds of different ways. And I don't need to know about them or be involved in them or volunteer with them. And there may be ones that I really don't like and think, oh, that's not how I would do it, but that's okay, right? Like the evolution towards a new paradigm that kind of checks my, working in service of life box, probably entails a whole bunch of things that I never would have thought of, don't understand, and maybe don't even like. I guess I would, if someone were to say to me, okay, I kind of follow you and I kind of like what you're getting at, but what are you telling me to do? I would offer the following. I put the first breadcrumb there about put yourself in the paradigm you want. And I want to just clarify what that isn't. Like if you've ever found yourself doom scrolling, right, or complaining about all the things that are going on, you are not in the paradigm you want. And by the way, I'm not saying you need to be Pollyanna, like, things could be worse, or like, can't complain. No, that is not the paradigm you want. That's kind of pitying martyrdom, which go for it. I'm sure I do that myself. But that is not putting yourself in the paradigm you want. It even means going into very dark, difficult places, noticing, for instance, a theme that I am trying to understand better, read more about, and participate more in the context. So I'm sitting here in Montreal, Canada. We have a very big unfinished truth and reconciliation conversation underway in this land. And I am a white settler, and I am a benefactor of the colonial system that caused atrocities that they are fathomable. I mean, I'm sure there's some that are not fathomable, and those that are, it feels horrible to fathom them. It is a terrible circumstance. And unfortunately, lies and genocidal policies persist. Like, that's how endemic this stuff is that people are like, yeah, we did some bad things a while ago. No, we're still doing bad things. And the year I graduated from university, we still had active residential schools that were part of removing children from their parents. This was national policy. This wasn't just, a few bad actors. So why am I saying that in the context of being in the paradigm I want? Because I think the paradigm I want involves dealing with that. It involves going into those spaces, not to feel guilty, not to cry and, or do what you need to do. If you feel guilty, feel guilty. If tears come up, that's quite natural. And go there and find people and awareness and activities and ways of being and knowing that move through that. Because just saying that happened in the past and we don't want to repeat that is what causes us to keep repeating it. So do not doom scroll, notice the shadows, and then be present with them and understand. That to me is a paradigmatic shift. It doesn't always feel like, unicorns and rainbows. And that leads very quickly to something that is hard. And I will tell you that it is counterintuitive, but I find this very motivating. So I think it's really important to stay open to different viewpoints. Now, that's kind of a cliche, right? Well, you got to listen to different points of view and don't get in an echo chamber and don't be too siloed. Okay. First of all, a lot of people don't really do that. It's hard, right? I have my beliefs, my views, my values. I stand behind them, right? That's fair. And I think that's true of me. I need to be really careful that doesn't mean, and so I am polarized. And so I feel so strongly about what I feel that whatever you feel, if it's not what I feel, I'm not even going to notice you. I'm not going to hear you. I'm not going to listen to you. We're seeing that in a lot of contexts in our society. I could, rattle off a couple quick ones, things like who a national leader should be, whether or not to experience certain medical procedures, how and if to proceed in relation to a change in climate. These are highly polarizing topics. Those are three topics that I've had some direct exposure to based on where I've lived and how I live. And I think it's critical to really engage with, not just like have on your Twitter feed and see sound bites of, but actually talk to, walk alongside, join, have meals with, be with people who experience the world in a different way. Sometimes that's not possible. Like there's either too much hostility or I'm too much of an outsider or whatever. I don't belong in every conversation, of course. But where I can find, and it's usually connected to that, seek out the other paradigm, right? Because where I see people who are living in ways that I feel are very open and resilient and moving towards these things that I think are going to belong in that future economy, they're often also people who are open to different ways of experiencing the world. They may stand behind their views and values. They may say, I'm voting for this one for this reason. I did or didn't take this, vaccination, whatever the point of view may be, they stand behind it and they have good reasons, but they don't shut out the rest of the world because they're aware. And I try to stay aware that whatever that grievance is that is very vocal and sometimes actually quite violent and disturbing, it's coming from something. And to just wipe it away as ignorant or misinformed, or whatever word gets thrown in all directions, that's not helping. It's not motivating. And when I go the other way, when I stay really open, I'm like, wow, this is another way of experiencing the world that I didn't understand. I learned, for example, climate, carbon tunnel vision. Whoa, it's a thing. And I've propagated it. I've been at the table doubling down on those net zero ambitions. I've been there pushing for more and more, detailed carbon disclosures. Whoa, what am I missing? And when I widen and go, well, I'm missing biodiversity. And when you go into biodiversity, the journey is beautiful. The people
Yeah.
you meet, the things you find out. So we need to really, truly stay open and be uncomfortable, not to convince others. That I put convincing right beside doom scrolling, because if I'm doom scrolling, I'm not in the paradigm I want. If I'm staying open, I'm learning new things, and then I'm trying to convince other people of them, then I'm still part of the problem. I'm kind of reinforcing, polarizing. And then the third little breadcrumb on this that I find incredibly motivating, and it's connected to this staying open, it kind of has happened as a result, is listening in all kinds of ways to things beyond human conversation. And we could call that getting out in nature. We could call it forest bathing. I don't care what you call it. Listen to the non-human lives around us, because the wisdom is there. And that might sound oversimplified, like, yeah, biomimicry is really cool, check out how forests work, there's zero waste and there's no one leader. And I think that's all true. Like, yeah, go there for sure. That's a really fun place. But even more than that, I'll give maybe a concrete example, then I'll be quiet. I remember one time I'd been in Brazil on a trip for work a few years back, and spent some time with amazing people. They just really teach me so much. And then I was back at the time I was living in New York, and I was walking down the street, and like I am now, I was wearing something where my neck was exposed. And all of a sudden there was this breeze that like wrapped around my neck. And I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I felt like Brazil just blew by. And I was like, wow, this wind very well possibly was in Brazil sometime. Was it yesterday? Was it
Yeah.
14 hours ago? Was it 14 years ago? Was it 14,000 years ago? I don't know. All I knew was I felt the wisdom
Hmm.
of this wind. And I realized I'd never listened to the wind. I'd heard it in the trees, thought of it as a sound, but I never really paused and asked myself, what else does this wind have to offer? What can it teach me? That's a very big question that I'll probably take to my grave. But just asking it and listening as I move among the non-human world is so illuminating. It helps me keep moving. It helps me want to keep moving, and it shows me ways to move. So I find it very motivating.
Hmm.
Anyway, I'll pause there. I don't even remember what question I'm asking here or answering, so I'll give it back to you.
No, that's such a lovely example. And thank you also for touching on the importance of listening to one another, truly listening and being with, and not just wanting to persuade people of our side. That's really the essence of what this podcast is about. And I just wanted to comment on your example of climate change and the tunnel vision. This is something that I've thought about and have been writing about as well. In this example of listening to one another, of course, we have people who are very active and advocating for climate, behaviors and sustainability. And then there's the so-called climate skeptics. And if we are to trust that every human being in both sides of this divided world holds some wisdom, what wisdom is there in the climate skeptics or the climate deniers? And it might not be necessarily that they're, anything regarding, like, the science is all real, but could that skepticism be coming from a place of, I think, maybe observing that we don't have the whole story, meaning that there's this narrow focus on carbon emissions and not, as you say, biodiversity and all the other contributors? Is that where skepticism is coming from? Is there some wisdom there that's picking up on a sort of blindness on the other side that people are trying to reflect back in some way? And I think that's a perfect example of the importance of having to trust that even in the most crazy or conspiracy oriented ideas, what is being reflected back that people on the other side are not seeing. So just a thought.
Yeah. Do we have time for me to reflect on
Please,
that?
please. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I totally agree. And I want to push the idea one layer further, because I've noticed that even staying in language of sides propagates sides.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, noting like the climate skeptics, where it might sound crazy and there's like conspiracy stuff going on in there. As soon as I hear that, I want to dig in further, partly because what I've learned, I think this isn't new, but it's kind of newly reinforced for me, is that giving a group of people a label of any type from any angle is problematic. Not just because it's not nice. Like, I don't just mean that in a polite way. I mean, it creates problems, big problems that make the people on the other side who gave them the label, who thought they were trying to solve the problem, makes the problem worse. So I'll use climate as an example. We talk about climate deniers. It's a label that's out there. We talk about climate skeptics, and the assumption that I hear, so I'm paraphrasing, and if this doesn't feel like it resonates with some people, then I certainly don't want to put words in anyone's mouths, but I'm describing things I've heard pretty regularly from a lot of people. So what gets said about the climate deniers and climate skeptics is they are ignoring the science on which there is consensus. They are unwilling to relinquish power. They don't see the danger and the urgency. And we really just have to either ignore them or take away their toys, right? Or take away their power, because where they're going is unacceptable. And so, down with the climate deniers, down with the climate skeptics. And then that usually gets bundled into, because we got to double down on reducing emissions, and we need serious policy that's going to get us there, and. Well, let's say that all that's true, and let's play that out a little bit. What happens? Well, what happens is what we're seeing in some areas where there's what would be called progressive climate policy. I'll use an example here that I don't know if it's actually still true. I haven't checked if this policy has changed, but it's true a couple of years ago. So we'll say it's an example. Where here in Canada, if you bought an electric car under certain circumstances, certain timing, certain whatever details, I don't know. I don't own a car, so I didn't do this, but I know the policy existed that if you bought an electric car, you got a $5,000 rebate. That was seen as very progressive climate policy. Why? Because we want to electrify the car world, because it was money, like $5,000. That's not nothing, right? So that's a good, better than a kick in the pants. And it was seen as a real incentive for behavior change. Matt, if everybody bought an electric car tomorrow, let's just say they could, like I guess there's shortages of these things right now, but let's just say they could, we would be so much more screwed than we already are, because we just have more cars on the road made of more metal with more electronic things inside them that required more mined minerals, that required all kinds of stuff to amp up the electrification infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't talked to anybody whose knowledge of climate science and energy grid science and all the, let's say, big picture science I trust, who actually thinks that's a winning way forward. Those folks who, and these are like a variety of people, I'd say they're like generally all English speaking and mostly Northern, so it's not the most diverse group, but I'd say the very knowledgeable climate folks I know are not deeply in favor of mass consumption of more vehicles, period. So if we take this kind of liberal, I'll use the term, view of like, we need to double down on the climate policy, and also we need to meet the people where we are, I'm sorry, but we're screwed. That is a terrible policy. What would a good policy be? Well, here's one. give the people who don't own cars and take public transit, walk and cycle $5,000. Triple the cost of cars. Remove asphalt and rewild it, and then give it also to foot and cycling and non-motorized pathways.
Mhm.
That actually enables the conditions for life to thrive. There'd be fewer
Mhm.
vehicle accidents, way more living things. And frankly, I would find getting around a lot more fun. But then you get people going, oh, okay, come on, you got to be realistic. Okay, well, fine, but don't pretend that that is helping with the climate, because it's
Right.
not. It's helping with the consumption of more automobiles and vehicular transportation and the electrification of the grid, which does not solve for climate. So now let's back away. Let's go, okay, well, that was a scenario and you were saying it's true. I'm going to say those comments they make, those comments that get made about climate skeptics and deniers, I've been recently digging a lot more into those and learning that, of course, all of these people are not climate skeptics and deniers. There are people who have views that don't align with that narrative.
Right. And they get automatically lumped and labeled into that
Lumped,
category.
big bucket of people who disagree with what is obviously correct. And so they are deniers. They are the anti something that doesn't align with me. And in fact, this is where the most fruitful, thoughtful, detailed, the homework some of these people do, I look and think, good Lord, I didn't actually look at the IPCC report that closely, but you did. And when I
Mhm.
follow your footnotes, because I'm a footnote follower, I don't take in pretty much any mainstream media. I take in a lot of diverse independent voices. And when it's footnoted, I follow the footnote. I'm like, where'd that come from? Who paid for it? Did you misquote it? Did you just take one line? And I gotta say, these folks are doing real homework. They're doing a real service for the world. They're not denying, or I keep saying they, what I'm looking at, the work of a lot of people, these are people who are not denying that the climate is changing. They are suggesting that the way it's being addressed is problematic.
Yeah.
And there are other ways to address it, maybe even better ways. So I say all that to say that is what I believe it looks like to not be polarized. As soon as you've heard me do it a couple times in the last minute, as soon as I hear myself saying they, I'm like,
Mm.
wait, why am I using that word? Am I using it to group people? Is it an effective grouping of people? Because maybe it's not, and I'm polarizing. How can I step back from that? And it's tricky. I mean, it's been an interesting couple of years, right? We've had some challenging times. We have more ahead. Just saying a word like trucker in Canada is an immediately polarizing word in both directions, or let's say all directions. How do we step out of that polarizing? And I can tell you, I've had some very challenging conversations with people I know and love, where you're not allowed to step out of it. And I say, well, we really have to, because just yelling louder or yelling at the people for yelling doesn't stop the yelling, and it definitely doesn't create the healing. It definitely does not move us into that paradigm where we look after each other and where we move into spaces that feel good. So we have a tremendous opportunity. I have a tremendous opportunity to notice how and where I am being polarized and contributing to polarization, and asking myself, what does it look like when I step out of that and really allow for a different kind of knowing, of holding space, of listening, sensing into what's possible. Yeah, that's a big one. It's not always fun, but I think it's worth doing.
Gosh, I wish I could just take that last 5 minutes there and like use that as like the as like the promotion for this podcast. I mean, that
Aw,
was
thank you.
perfect.
Thank you.
And I agree wholeheartedly. And I think I share in a very similar observation of what's happening. I feel like there is so much that we could say on that, so much more we could say on the other topics we've been talking about. I wanted to ask you too about the materiality assessments, but I'm wondering if we need to schedule maybe a part two of this. Would would you be potentially open to that?
I'd love it. Yeah. I mean, I planted a seed about materiality, and if folks are curious, it would really be for the like uber nerds in the ESG and sustainability world. Although I tried to make it, as open source conceptually as well as technically as possible. But absolutely, I'm happy to join a conversation like this anytime. It's a real pleasure.
Awesome. And I will definitely link to that information in the show notes, and so that people can dive into it. I took a look through myself at some of the materiality assessments that you did for Google and for I think it's TD Bank, and this is really really interesting, and I think really helps to support in creating this new paradigm that you were speaking of. So I will definitely make that information available to people. Anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to add for today?
Gosh, well, thanks. I just love these kinds of rich conversations. I guess I might just leave your listeners with something that's been really helping me lately. As you noticed, I touched a lot of motivation, or like, how do I keep going? Because these, I sound cheerful, I'm smiling as I talk, but we're talking about some pretty big, difficult things, and they matter on a personal level, they matter on a family level, on a community level. So I don't take these things lightly, and yet I feel enthused and I keep going. And so the thing that I've been finding really helps me is being as clear as I can on my purpose. So I mentioned off the top, my purpose is to foster the shift towards an economy that works in service of life. I'm clear on that. I can rattle it off. And it continues to evolve. Well, what does that mean? How do I work in service? What would that economy look like? I gave my best cut at a definition on this particular Tuesday, but it's different than a few Tuesdays ago. And I know it'll be different. I love actually Tuesday because the way we pronounce it in English, it sounds like choose day. So we get to choose. So I would really encourage people to ask themselves genuinely and with compassion, not pressure, not guilt, not like, oh, I'm whatever years old and I'm here, this is all I do or whatever. No, really, truly, like, what is your purpose, and how does it get you up in the morning, and how can you live into it? What is your role in living that purpose out? And it will change. Mine has changed a lot in the last year. I expect some turbulence ahead, but knowing why I'm here really helps me in those dark moments, and in the lighter moments it just puts extra wind in my sails. So I invite people to check in on what their purpose is, and whatever they need to figure that out, ask for it. The world is excited about helping people with their purpose. There's all kinds of ways. So be honest about what it is, explore ways to know, and then just lean into that purpose every single day.
I really love that. And it sort of takes us back to almost where we started as far as this process of being willing to kind of not know and discover as things unfold, but aligning ourselves with the intention of wanting to discover, whether that's within ourselves or that's with other people in this larger system that we're a part of. So thank you so much, Lorraine. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show.